While Spanish and Portuguese colonization in the New World is relatively well known, of course, other countries in Europe didn't want to be left out on all this newfound wealth that was coming across the Atlantic. Many other countries and companies attempted to establish colonies that they thought would enrich them, and perhaps among the least well known of these was the German attempt to establish colonies in the New World with the short-lived colony of Klein Venedig. Though Germany didn't even exist as a unified country until 1870, the people of the German principalities of the Holy Roman Empire were as interested as anybody else in trying to strike it rich by conquering a New World empire like the Aztecs or the Incas. Some were even driven to distraction, seeking the legendary lost city of gold, El Dorado. The German attempt to colonize the New World is history that deserves to be remembered. In 1519, Charles I, King of Spain, was elected Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Any imperial election was contentious and mostly involved an enormous expenditure of money. Charles faced Francis, King of France, and Henry VIII, King of England. All parties relied on borrowing money to bribe the electors, and one of Charles's most important lenders was the German Welser family, which lent him more than 140,000 florins. Their support was given in exchange for imperial privileges that few others enjoyed, licenses for trading enslaved Africans, and participation in the conquest of the New World. Bartholomeus Welser, head of the family, was created a prince of the empire and made a privy councillor to the emperor himself. The Welsers were a banking family based largely in Augsburg and Nuremberg, both of which were imperial free cities within the empire. They claimed descent from the famed Byzantine general Belisarius, and by the 15th century had become a wealthy trading family with trade connections all over Europe and the Levant. Their support of Charles V involved large loans to finance his election and the many wars the empire fought during his regency. As early as 1523, the family had involved itself in the New World when they became involved in the slave trade in the Caribbean to support sugar production in Santo Domingo. In 1526, agents established a trading establishment there, and in 1532 they purchased one of the larger sugar mills on the island. In 1527, the privileges they had received in 1519 were confirmed in the Contract of Madrid. Bartholomeus Welser had lent the emperor such a large sum of money that the contract also gave them, as security, the province of Venezuela, which they developed as Klein Venedig, or Little Venice. It is often known as Welserland in Germany. The province began with the 1527 foundation of Santa Ana de Coro by a Spanish officer. The Welsers were given the rights to explore, rule, and colonize the area at their own expense, but could only enlist Spanish and Flemish troops for that purpose. They fitted out 2 expeditions and built 2 cities and 3 forts within 2 years. The contract was partially in response to reports from a nearby province that conquest was difficult due to bellicose Indians armed with arrows. The Welsers were to pacify that land and to place it in our service in a manner that we can profit from it. The venture was risky, but promised huge rewards through large investment. Though it was to be German-run, the colony itself was to remain Spanish. In general, foreigners weren't permitted to colonize, and besides leadership, only 50 expert German miners were allowed to acquire precious metals. Besides gold and other valuables, the Welsers expected to make money by enslaving the natives. Abuse of indigenous Americans was so widespread that Spain had tried to curb it. There was a royal requirement that the natives could not be enslaved if they accepted Charles as their king. But in practice, nearly all the native tribes could be dubbed rebellious and enslaved at the conquistadors' whims. As with most Spanish colonial ventures, any wealth extracted was owed in part to the crown, at first a tenth, and within 10 years the full royal fifth. Ambrosius Ehinger, an agent for the banking family in Madrid, was chosen as the first governor, made captain general of Klein Venedig. A fleet was sent in 1528, and Ehinger himself left Seville on October 7th. He arrived in February of 1529 with 281 colonists after stopping in Santo Domingo. One of his first acts was to rename Santa Ana de Coro New Augsburg. The Spanish success looting the Aztec Empire had fed European hunger for more gold and more rich New World empires that could easily be conquered. Francisco Pizarro would reach the Inca only a few years later, further firing the minds of gold-hungry explorers. Rumors of yet greater wealth encouraged the Spanish and others to continue exploring. Several conquistadors wrote of a king who covered himself in gold dust, either as part of a ritual or because to powder oneself with gold is an extraordinary thing. The conquistador Diego de Ordaz heard rumors of Meta, city of gold somewhere near the Orinoco River, which flowed through Klein Venedig. The legend of El Dorado was nascent in 1529, but everyone was sure that great wealth remained to be conquered somewhere in South America. The search for such a kingdom became the driving force behind all of the Welser's efforts in Venezuela. In 1529, Ehinger launched his first expedition into the interior. Ehinger had explored the coastline and found the mouth of a large lake, now known as Lake Maracaibo. He hoped to explore the lake and find a water passage to the South Sea, the Pacific. He left with 180 men, the royal notary, 37 horses, and 150 natives that carried supplies. By Spanish law, the royal notary was required to read the requisitions in Spanish to native people, which essentially demanded that they convert to Catholicism and accept Charles as king or face conquest. The first expedition was a taste of the difficulties that the Germans would face throughout their rule. Local tribes, already antagonized by Spanish slave traders along the coast, resisted the Germans in a series of battles. Ehinger was able to found a small town on the northern shore of Lake Maracaibo, which he christened New Nuremberg. The name Maracaibo was given to the lake, according to legend, after a brave native chief named Mara, who was killed in the fighting. Ehinger continued to explore without much success. After 14 months, and with 60 of his men and even more of his native baggage train dead, Ehinger limped back to New Augsburg, sick with malaria. After a year without contact, the Welsers had decided Ehinger was dead and sent a replacement. The replacement, Johann Seisenhofer, died within weeks of arriving in Venezuela, so Ehinger was accepted as governor again. Ehinger left for Santo Domingo to recover and left the colony under the command of Nicholas Federmann, a young Welser agent. Although Federmann had been ordered to remain at New Augsburg, he soon set off on his own expedition, saying he found himself with a number of men who were unoccupied. He determined to undertake a campaign into the interior, towards the south of the Southern Sea, in the hope of finding something profitable. On September 12, 1530, with 100 soldiers, 2 monks, 16 horses, and numerous natives carrying his supplies, he found little, but returned in March of 1531 with around half of his men dead. Ehinger was there to meet him. Recovered and furious, he banished Federmann from the territory, and Federmann returned to Germany. Ehinger set off in June on another expedition with around 130 men, 40 horses, along with a train of native porters. Porters were enslaved men who were chained together by the necks. One became ill or injured, they were simply decapitated so that the roped columns could continue without slowing. Ehinger moved south from Lake Maracaibo, soon crossing out of Klein Venedig and into the neighboring Santa Marta territory. He was chasing rumors of a kingdom rich with gold somewhere further south, but his methods were brutal. According to a contemporary chronicler, Ehinger dealt with the natives without compassion, a great deal more cruelty than any of the other tyrants, which we have spoken before. Ehinger was more unnatural and fierce than raging tigers or wolves or ramping lions. The German laid desolate and destroyed more than 400 leagues of most fertile land, there and of provinces exceeding and wonderful. Indigenous people who came in friendship were cut to pieces, leaders were enslaved, and captives were burned alive in their huts. For his horrors, he collected 600 pounds of gold, precious stones, and a large number of slaves. After 4 months of marching, Ehinger reached the Zapatosa March, where he set up a camp. He sent 35 men under a Spanish captain back towards New Augsburg with the treasure, with orders to bring back reinforcements. The captain chose to avoid retracing their steps through hostile territory, but was soon lost. The native porters escaped, and instead of carrying the gold themselves, they buried it under a tree, never to be found again. The party disintegrated in the wilderness, and most of the men were hunted down by natives or starved. Only one, Francisco Martin, survived, and he was captured and made a life with a local tribe. Ehinger waited for a few months before deciding that he had been abandoned. Instead of going home empty-handed, he sent scouts south into the mountains, the towering Andes. Scouts brought back encouraging news of heavily populated highlands ripe for the picking. The mountains brought relief from mosquitoes, but more and more men died from the cold and altitude. Starving, the party ate their dogs and horses and faced constant skirmishes with local tribes. Ehinger failed to find a way over the mountains, finally turned back. The party was attacked on May 27, 1533, by a particularly fierce group of locals. Ehinger and another man fled into a low ravine, where they were pinned down by archers. Ehinger was hit in the neck with a poisoned arrow. He died a few days later. Despite dwindling numbers, the survivors continued to loot and pillage, and finally the few haggard survivors reached New Augsburg in November 1533, after 26 months of travel. After Ehinger's death, Federmann lobbied for the government of Venezuela, and he was appointed and served briefly, but Spanish authorities soon had him demoted. Instead, Georg von Speyer, a 33-year-old Welser agent, was appointed. With a fresh supply of Spanish troops, he arrived in Klein Venedig in 1534 to take over from Fetterman, who became his second-in-command. Speyer then heard rumors of Meta, and on May 13, 1535, left with a force of several hundred, but without Fetterman, who was ordered to defend a valley between Klein Venedig and Santa Marta. Europeans struggled through the wilderness, sick with malaria and hounded by jaguars. By February of 1536, he met a friendly tribe which told him of a gold-rich culture to the west, on a plateau among the mountains. He spent a year seeking a pass across the mountains before finally calling off the expedition in August of 1537. Reached New Augsburg in May of 1538 after more than 3 years of exploration. Speyer retired as governor in 1539, died in 1540, possibly fighting against an attempted coup d'etat by Spanish forces in the territory. While he was gone, Fetterman had taken off on his own expedition. If he actually went to the valley he'd been ordered to, he stayed there only briefly. With 400 men, he headed south after Speyer in the spring of 1536. He seems to have deliberately avoided beating Speyer, moving further west across plains that stretch out like a sea, rivers innumerable, cut them in all directions, and marshes intersect them. Fetterman stayed apprised of Speyer by speaking to the locals and carefully avoided meeting Speyer on his return trip in 1538. Like Speyer, Fetterman and his men searched the mountains for a pass. By 1538, half of his men were gone, and their clothes had literally rotted away. After climbing the mountains and failing to find a pass for nearly a year, in 1539 he finally came across one. The pass, 13,000 feet high and so difficult it's rarely used today, was its own challenge, but after struggling through it, Fetterman finally reached the plateau, and he thought El Dorado. Fetterman sent a scout out and was shocked to learn that the scout had promptly run into a camp, not of natives, but of Spaniards. While the Germans had been struggling east of the mountains, a Spanish expedition from Santa Marta had beat them there. The people of the plateau were at least potentially a source of the enduring legends the conquistadors had heard mostly secondhand throughout the region. It was a Muiska religious rite, apparently extinct by the time the Spanish arrived, that may have led to the El Dorado legend, where a chief would be coated in sticky resin and rolled in gold dust before jumping in a lake. The Muiska, however, were not miners. They mostly grew potatoes, but had become wealthy by trading salt and emeralds. Protected by the mountains, they had persevered against hostile tribes and grown relatively powerful, but their confederation was not another Inca or Aztec empire. While Fetterman was still struggling to find a way to the plateau, Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada had finally reached the Muiska from the north and conquered the whole confederation, killing the leaders, including the Zipa, Bogota, for whom Quesada named his settlement, today the capital of Colombia. Before Fetterman could arrive, a second group of Spaniards under another conquistador arrived from Quito in the south. There were apparently no hard feelings, and all three left Bogota to Cartagena and from there to Europe to report to Emperor Charles. Fetterman found his employers furious. Not only had he not found El Dorado, he had essentially abandoned the colony. The Bishop of Santo Domingo managed the colony briefly and found the colony in disarray. But in typical Spanish fashion, he immediately decided that the solution was to find El Dorado. He put Philip von Hutten, a Welser relation who had been with Speyer on his ill-fated expedition, in charge. Hutten left in July of 1541 with around 200 men, along with Bartholomeus Welser, son of the banking family's leader. And like all the expeditions, they suffered against nature, survived for a time on cornmeal and ants. Hutten was left enamored of the dream of El Dorado, resisted following every rumor, and after several months he broke off with a contingent of about 40 men, following more solid rumors about a wealthy civilization to the south. Hutten reached a group of Caribs called the Omaguas, or Flatheads. At the Omagua capital, Hutten was seriously wounded when an enormous, reportedly 15,000-strong army attacked his small party. They escaped with no casualties, but several serious injuries. Hutten survived his wounds, but was too weak to lead the party back to New Augsburg and supported Welser for leader instead. A fight broke out, and several of the Spanish men broke from the group to find their own way home. And by the time they began limping home in 1543, they had been gone 2 years. New Augsburg had gone through a series of leaders, the last of which, Juan de Carvajal, left New Augsburg to found his own city. In 1546, he intercepted Hutten and Welser and tried to capture them. When they escaped, he offered them safe passage, but instead seized them a few days later and then had them beheaded. Thus ended the experiment of Klein Venedig. Carvajal himself was beheaded in punishment later in 1546, but the assassinations of Welser and Hutton put an end to the Welser control of Venezuela. The Germans had simply proven that they were not competent to run a colony, and the Spanish weren't going to let them try again. After a series of claims and counterclaims and judicial actions, the emperor revoked the Welser claim. German after German had come to the new province only to abandon all their responsibilities and run off in search of gold that they never found. And the consequences were horrendous. Because of brutality and disease and warfare, entire cultures were laid waste. Entire areas were depopulated. Of course, the German colonization of the New World turned out to be an utter failure, but Professor Giovanna Montenegro of Binghamton University argued in a 2018 edition of the journal Transit that the Welser story was rediscovered and romanticized in literature in Germany after unification, and thus became a primary driver for German imperialism in the 1880s and 1890s, and of the expansionist attitude of Hitler's Third Reich. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.